Usually when we think about the fundamental laws of physics, we expect them to be this immutable source code of the universe.
Right, yeah, like gravity just works.
Exactly. If you hold an apple out and drop it, it falls. If you touch an open flame to a piece of dry cotton, the cotton catches fire, it burns. We treat these as unquestionable objective facts.
Totally.
It's a closed, entirely predictable system, and we rely on that.
We do. I mean, it is incredibly comforting to view the world that way. We as a species desperately like living in a universe where the rules of cause and effect are locked in.
Yeah, where they don't just spontaneously change between breakfast and lunch.
Exactly. That predictability is the bedrock of literally everything from, basic survival to modern astrophysics.
But then you step into the intellectual ferment of the early Islamic empire, and suddenly that comforting source code is, well, it's entirely up for debate.
Oh, it is shattered.
We are talking about a philosophical landscape where, according to some of the most brilliant thinkers of the age, fire doesn't actually burn cotton at all.
Which is just a wild thing to wrap your head around.
It really is. Rather, they argued the universe is being re-rendered like frame by frame, atom by atom, by a divine programmer who could just as easily decide to let the cotton sit there completely unarmed.
It is the absolute definition of metaphysical muddy waters.
Right.
And it forces you to question literally everything you think you know about reality. When you dig into these texts, you start to realize that what we casually call, the laws of nature might just be a very localized assumption.
Welcome to today's deep dive into the source material. Our mission today is to explore this incredible, highly volatile intellectual ferment of the early centuries of Islamic philosophy.
And it is a huge era to cover.
Massive. We are talking about an expansive period stretching roughly from the 7th century all the way up to the devastating fall of Baghdad.
Yeah.
We've got a towering stack of historical texts in front of us today specifically, detailed excerpts from a comprehensive history of Muslim philosophy. And these texts document exactly how early thinkers wrestled with the ultimate heavy-hitting questions.
The big ones.
Right. We're talking about the nature of existence, the paradox of free will, the exact physical or non-physical nature of God, and the very limits of human intellect.
And it is a vast, really complicated landscape to navigate. To truly grasp what's happening in these texts, you have to understand the environment first.
Set the stage for us.
Well, this isn't just a bunch of guys sitting in a vacuum having abstract thoughts.
Yeah.
The translation of ancient Greek philosophical texts into Arabic during the early Abbasid Caliphate, it acted as a massive, world-altering catalyst.
Like dropping a intellectual bomb.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Particularly under Caliph al-Ma'mun in the 9th century. There was this huge state-sponsored initiative to bring the knowledge of the Greeks, the Persians, the Indians, right into the Arabic-speaking world.
The famous House of Wisdom in Baghdad.
Precisely. But here is the critical point. It wasn't just a passive reception of old ideas. It wasn't a museum. It was an active, volatile, often dangerous collision. A collision between the rigorous, unyielding logic of Greek philosophy, so Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, and the revealed, text-based certainties of Islamic revelation.
And to navigate this collision today, we are going to be exploring 6 distinct movements that emerged from the wreckage and the synthesis of that era.
It's a fascinating lineup.
It really is. We are going to look at the ultra-rationalist Mutazilites who put logic above all else. Then the massive orthodox reaction of the Ash'arites who built this just wild metaphysical system to defend God's power.
Yeah, that's where the atoms come in.
Right, the atoms. After that, we'll look at the moderate balancers who tried to walk a tightrope between those two extremes, known as the Tahawis and Maturidists.
Right.
Then we'll pivot sharply to the strict, uncompromising literalists called the Zahiris. And finally, we will uncover a mysterious, underground secret society known as the Ikhwan al-Safa.
The Brethren of Purity.
Yeah, who believed in a grand theory of spiritual evolution.
It's a philosophical spectrum that covers, well, every possible angle of how humans try to understand the divine.
And I want to say right to you, the listener, while this might sound like dense ancient history, I promise you it is not. The core debate these scholars were having, how to balance pure human reason, established tradition, literal interpretations of text, and scientific
It's
observation.
the exact same stuff we're dealing with now.
It's exactly the same struggle you and I face today. Every time you open your phone and try to figure out what's true in our era of, information overload, algorithms, and ideological echo chambers, you are engaging in that exact same epistemological crisis these scholars were having 1,000 years ago.
Absolutely.
And as always, we are just here to unpack what the sources say. We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing any specific theological view, whether left, right, orthodox, or unorthodox. We are simply here to marvel at the sheer architectural scale of their arguments.
Just reporting the history.
Exactly. Okay, let's
Yeah.
unpack this. Where do we even begin?
I think the most logical place to start is with the first major organized movement, which is the Mutazilites.
Okay.
They really set the board for the next several centuries of debate, mainly because they forced everyone else to react to them. They were thoroughgoing, unapologetic rationalists.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, their fundamental, unshakable stance was that theoretical reason must be the ultimate arbiter of whatever is revealed in Scripture.
So reason beats text.
Yes. If the text says something that seems illogical, it's not logic that's broken. It's our understanding of the text that needs to be adjusted.
And they have a fantastic, almost cinematic origin story.
They really do.
The texts tell us that this all started in a mosque in Basra, roughly 2 centuries after the birth of Islam. The highly esteemed Imam al-Hasan al-Basri, a massive figure in early Islamic scholarship, was teaching his pupils. Just a normal day. Then, someone comes in and asks a highly charged, incredibly dangerous question. Back then, there was a fierce, bloody debate tearing the empire apart. If a true believer commits a grave sin, are they still considered a believer, or do they become an unbeliever who is doomed to hell?
And we really have to pause and emphasize the stakes of that question for the listener. This wasn't just a polite theological puzzle.
No, it was literally life and death.
Exactly. Politically and spiritually.
Right.
There were extremist groups at the time who believed that committing a major sin completely expelled you from the faith. And in their view, if you weren't a believer, your life and property were forfeit.
Wow.
So asking this question in a public mosque was like dropping a live grenade into the room.
Right. So Imam al-Hasan al-Basri pauses. He is formulating a careful, nuanced answer. But before the imam can even speak, one of his pupils, a guy named Wasil ibn Atta, who the historical text specifically and somewhat hilariously notes had a very long neck.
Yeah, that detail always gets me.
It's so random, but this long-necked pupil stands up and boldly interrupts his master. He declares that the grave sinner is neither a perfect believer nor a complete unbeliever. Instead, the sinner is in an intermediate state, a sort of theological purgatory, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, without waiting for a response, Wasil just strides over to another corner of the mosque, leans against a different pillar, and starts explaining this brand new doctrine to anyone who will listen.
It is a phenomenal dramatic exit. I mean, you can imagine the tension in the room.
Oh, you could cut it with a knife.
Imam al-Hasan al-Basri looks over at his former student holding court in the corner and says, "He is withdrawn from us." And in Arabic, the word for withdraw or secede is itazala, which gives us the name Mutazila.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so they became known by everyone else as the withdrawers.
Well, to be fair, nobody likes being called a withdrawer.
Right, no one wants that brand.
They didn't use that name for themselves. They preferred a much grander, much more self-righteous title, the people of unity and justice.
Which perfectly encapsulates their 2 core non-negotiable principles. Let's look at the justice piece first, because it deals with a problem every religion struggles with: free will.
The big one.
Yeah. For the Mutazilites, human beings must have absolute, uncompromised free will. Why? Because if God predetermined all our actions, like if God wrote the script where a specific person commits a horrible sin and literally forced them to act it out and then punish that person in hell for doing exactly what they were programmed to do, that would make God inherently unjust.
It violates the basic human logic of fairness. I mean, imagine a programmer creating a robot designed strictly to walk off a cliff and then getting angry at the robot when it falls.
Right.
It makes no sense. The programmer is the one at fault.
Exactly. And the Mutazilites refused to worship a God that could be accused of being an unjust programmer. So to protect God's perfect justice, they argued that man has to be the sole author and creator of his own volitional acts. God wills that all beings should embrace obedience and do good, but man physically creates his own success or his own failure. Humans generate their own actions independently.
Okay, that makes logical sense, but it also feels like it puts a limit on God's power, right? If humans are out here creating actions that God didn't create, then God isn't the creator of all things.
That is exactly the critique their opponents will leverage against them later.
But before we get totally bogged down in that, there's the unity piece of their title, which I found totally mind-bending in the sources. The texts say the Mutazilites fiercely denied that God has distinct, separate attributes like knowledge or power or sight outside of his core essence.
This is where their Greek philosophical tools really start to show their edge. They applied strict Aristotelian logic to the nature of God. They argued that if you say God has knowledge, and you also believe that God is eternal, then you are implying that this thing called knowledge is also an eternal, distinct entity sitting alongside God.
Like a separate object in the room.
Right. And if you have God plus eternal knowledge, plus eternal power, plus eternal life, suddenly you have a plurality of eternals.
Okay.
You have multiple eternal things. And in strict Greek logic, if something is composed of multiple parts, it is a composite. And anything that is composite requires a composer, someone to put the parts together.
Oh, wow.
Which would mean God was created by something else, which obviously destroys the concept of an absolute, indivisible, eternal unity.
My brain is already starting to hurt, but I follow the logic. It's like if God is a cake made of flour, sugar, and eggs, someone had to bake the cake.
Yes.
So God can't have ingredients.
Exactly. So to solve this, a brilliant early Mutazilite thinker named Abu al-Hutayl formulated it this way. God doesn't have knowledge. God is knowledge.
Okay.
His power isn't an attribute attached to him. It is his very essence. There is no separation at all. It is absolute, undifferentiated unity.
It reminds me of this incredible story in the source material about Abu al-Hutayl debating a Magian, a Zoroastrian named Saleh.
Oh, that's a great story.
Salih belonged to a dualistic religion. He believed the universe was fundamentally made of two ultimate opposing principles, light and darkness. And he argued that the physical world was just a mixture of both.
Right.
And what's fascinating is Abu al-Hutayl doesn't quote scripture to him. He doesn't say, my book says you're wrong. He just uses pure surgical logic to dismantle the guy's entire worldview.
He really traps him.
He does. He asks Salih, is the mixture of light and darkness distinct from light and darkness, or is it identical to them? Salih says it's the same. So Abu Hutayl says, well, how can two diametrically opposing things mix themselves? Light wants to be light, dark wants to be dark. They repel.
Exactly.
There must be a third thing, a separate mixer, an outside force that forces them together, and that mixer is the single unified God. It is just pure, unadulterated debate logic.
And that reliance on pure logic, it didn't just stay in theology. It completely shaped how they viewed the physical scientific world, too. Well, the Mutazilites were obsessed with physics and atoms. You have figures like Al-Nizam, who was wrestling with the Greek paradoxes of space and time. Al-Nizam argued for the infinite divisibility of particles. He believed you could divide a particle endlessly.
Like Zeno's paradox, right?
Yes, exactly.
Where to walk across a room, you have to cross half the distance, then half the remaining distance, then half of that to infinity. So you should logically never be able to reach the other side.
Zeno's paradox was a huge problem for early philosophers. If space is infinitely divisible, how does anything ever move from point A to point B?
Right.
Al-Nizam came up with this bizarre, fascinating concept of the leap. He argued that objects don't glide smoothly through infinite points. They move by literally leaping over spatial points. It's an attempt to account for infinite divisibility while allowing for actual motion.
Wait, so he was essentially arguing for quantum leaps centuries before quantum mechanics?
In a philosophical sense, yeah.
Like an electron disappearing from one orbit and reappearing in another without traversing the space in between.
Yes. He was conceptualizing motion not as a continuous slide, but as discrete jumps across an infinitely divisible space. It shows the sheer caliber of abstract thought happening here. And then you have thinkers who were deeply empirical, like Al-Jahiz.
Oh, I loved reading about Al-Jahiz. The sources describe him as a scientist-philosopher who practically anticipated the scientific method and, like Francis Bacon, by 7.5 centuries.
He was way ahead of his time.
He wasn't just sitting in an ivory tower thinking about atoms. He was getting his hands dirty. He literally experimented on animals, cutting their organs, even deliberately poisoning them to carefully observe the effects on the organism.
Yeah, he wrote a massive encyclopedia called the Book of Animals.
But here's the kicker. Even though he was a pioneering empirical scientist, he stated outright that while you gather data with your physical senses, human reason is the final determinant of truth, because your senses can easily lie to you.
Well, an optical illusion is a perfect example of senses lying. Reason has to step in and correct the flawed data. Al-Jahiz really embodies the absolute peak of Mutazilite confidence.
They were very confident.
Oh, incredibly. They believed that goodness and evil are objective, undeniable realities built into the fabric of the universe. Things aren't good just because God arbitrarily says they are good. God commands things because they are intrinsically, objectively good.
Right.
Therefore, human reason is so powerful that it can figure out objective morality even without a prophet or a revelation.
Okay, I hear all of this, and I have to push back. I have to introduce a challenge here.
Go for it.
If you are listening to this, you might be thinking, these guys sound like modern Enlightenment philosophers. But were the Mutazilites essentially just beta testing this theology using Greek tools? Because they pushed logic so incredibly far that they started breaking the religion they were trying to defend.
How do you mean?
Well, the texts show that by strictly applying this logic, they ended up denying so many traditional foundational beliefs that everyday Muslims held dear.
Give me an example of what you mean.
Well, the traditional belief was that believers would physically see God in paradise. The Mutazilites, absolutely not. Seeing requires a physical eye looking in a physical direction at a physical object, and God isn't physical, so seeing him is a logical impossibility.
Right.
They also denied the physical existence of the bridge over hell that souls must cross. They denied the physical weighing scales on Judgment Day that weigh your good and bad deeds.
That's theological.
Exactly. They even denied the existence of recording angels who write down human actions, arguing that an omniscient God doesn't need scribes with pens.
Which is logically sound, but...
But by making God this pure, abstract, impersonal essence and aggressively stripping away all these tangible, comforting metaphors, didn't they strip the mystery and the heart out of the religion for the average person on the street?
You've hit the exact breaking point of the movement. You really have. By reducing God to a bare, indefinable universality, a purely abstract mathematical unity, they completely alienated the masses. Think about it. The ordinary working-class believer in 9th century Baghdad doesn't pray to an abstract unity.
Right. They don't say, oh, great indivisible essence, help me.
Exactly. They don't cry out for help to an indivisible essence. They pray to a personal, listening, active God. Furthermore, and this is crucial historical context, the Mutazilites didn't just keep these ideas to themselves.
Oh, no. They got political.
Very political. Under the Abbasid caliphs, particularly al-Ma'mun, they gained immense political power. They became the state-sponsored theology. And what did these champions of reason and free will do with that power?
Let me guess.
They instituted an inquisition. They actively persecuted, imprisoned, and tortured scholars who disagreed with them and clung to traditional literal beliefs.
The classic paradox of the intellectual elite becoming tyrants.
Exactly. This combination of abstract, elite, bloodless theology and brutal political heavy-handedness perfectly set up the inevitable, massive orthodox backlash.
It swung the pendulum.
The pendulum had been pulled so far into the realm of pure Greek logic that when it swung back with incredible force.
Which brings us to the second major movement in our sources, and quite honestly, one of the most dramatic ideological pivots I have ever read about in intellectual history.
Oh, it's amazing.
The Orthodox counter-revolution known as Asherism.
Yes. The pendulum swings back violently against the Mutazilites, but it doesn't just revert to simple, blind faith. That's the key.
Right.
It swings back in a highly sophisticated, deeply systematized way. The Asherites decided to use the weapons of the philosophers against the philosophers.
The story of the founder, al-Ashari, is incredible. It's like a movie script.
It really is.
The sources tell us he was a star pupil, a golden boy of the Mutazilite school. He was studying under a renowned master named al-Jubai. Al-Ashari was in their camp, defending their doctrines for 40 years.
40 years. He was entrenched.
Deeply entrenched. And then one Friday, he walks into the Grand Mosque of Basra, climbs the steps of the pulpit, stands before the massive congregation, and publicly declares, and I'm paraphrasing here, "He who knows me knows who I am. Lo, I repent that I have been a Mutazilite. I renounce these opinions, and I take the engagement to refute the Mutazilites and expose their infamy."
Wow.
He literally strips off his robe and throws it down to symbolize shedding his past.
Wow.
He dedicates the rest of his life to using the very dialectical tools of the Mutazilites, the rigorous science of debate known as kalam, to absolutely destroy their arguments and defend the orthodox traditional faith.
It's a stunning defection.
Yep.
And the catalyst for this monumental break is legendary in the source material.
Tell me about it.
It centers on that exact problem we discussed earlier, whether God is bound by rational human concepts of what is fair or what is best for his creatures. Al-Ash'ari supposedly presented his former teacher, al-Jubai, with a deeply tricky riddle, an ethical trap about three brothers.
Yes. The riddle of the three brothers. I want to walk through this slowly because it perfectly illustrates the collapse of pure logic when applied to divinity.
Let's do it.
Al-Ash'ari asks his teacher to imagine three brothers. The first is a deeply pious, God-fearing brother. The second is a wicked, godless brother. The third is a brother who tragically died as a young infant. He asks his teacher what happens to them in the afterlife.
Right, and al-Jubai answers using standard, rock-solid, Mutazilite logic. He says, the God-fearing brother goes to heaven as a reward for his good choices. The godless brother goes to hell as a punishment for his bad choices. And the child goes to a neutral, safe place, a state of limbo, because he didn't live long enough to do good or evil, so it wouldn't be just to reward or punish him.
Makes perfect logical sense.
Completely.
But then Al-Ash'ari springs the trap. He asks, what if the child in limbo speaks up and says to God, why didn't you let me live to grow up so I could make good choices and get into the highest level of heaven with my pious brother? By killing me as a child, you denied me the chance at ultimate bliss.
The teacher, al-Jubai, responds, trying to maintain God's perfect justice and foresight. He says, God would reply to the child, I knew your nature. I knew that if you grew up, you would become a terrible sinner and go to eternal hell. So it was actually better and more just for you to die as a child.
To which Al-Ash'ari delivers the absolute knockout blow, he says. Then what if the godless brother, who is currently burning in hell, cries out, God, if you knew I was going to grow up to be a sinner and go to hell, why didn't you let me die as a child like my infant brother?
It's a checkmate.
It really is.
It's an unanswerable paradox. Al-Jubai was left completely speechless. The riddle mathematically proves that God's actions cannot be neatly boxed in by human definitions of rational justice or doing what is best. If God always does what is objectively best for everyone, the entire system falls apart under scrutiny.
It shatters the illusion that human reason can put a leash on God.
Precisely. Al-Ash'ari realizes in that moment that pure Greek-style reason has hard limits. You cannot subordinate the eternal will of the Creator to human logic. For the Ash'arites, God is absolutely terrifyingly free. He doesn't act teleologically.
What does that mean, teleologically?
Teleological means acting with the specific end goal or external purpose in mind.
Okay.
Humans act teleologically. I am thirsty, so my goal is to get water, so I walk to the sink. My action is driven by a need to fulfill a purpose.
Got it.
The Ash'arites argued that if God acted for a purpose, it implies that God lacks something and needs to fulfill it. It implies there is a standard of goodness outside of God that God is trying to achieve. That puts a limit on his omnipotence.
Oh, I see.
God does not act because it is good or just. Things are good and just only because God chooses to do them. God does whatever he wills simply because he wills it.
But if you listen to that, it immediately brings back the problem the Mutazilites were trying to solve in the first place. If God is totally, absolutely omnipotent and creates everything without being bound by human fairness, isn't man just a puppet? How can God punish anyone if he is the one pulling the strings?
They had an answer for that.
Yeah, the sources detail this really complex, highly nuanced compromise the Ash'arites came up with called iktisab, which translates to acquisition.
It is brilliant, but it is admittedly a bit dizzying. To avoid the fatalism that makes man a literal puppet, but to fiercely maintain the doctrine that God is the sole creator of all things, they split the atom of human action.
Explain that.
They argue that there are essentially two distinct components to every single human deed. First, there's the creation of the action, the actual generation of the physical power and the material completion of the deed. God alone does that.
And the second part?
Second, there's the choice, the intention, the internal leaning of the human will.
I need an analogy for this because it's slippery. Is it like driving a car? Let's say I am in the driver's seat of a self-driving car. I don't control the engine. I don't ignite the fuel. The car, representing God's power, provides 100% of the actual physical propulsion.
Okay, I like where this is going.
But I reach out and tap a button on the dashboard that says turn left. The car turns left. Did I physically turn the wheels? No. Did I generate the horsepower? No, but I intended the turn.
That is a phenomenal analogy.
Yeah.
Yes. God provides the horsepower, but man acquires the moral responsibility for the direction of the car through his internal intention to turn. Man's free choice, his internal intent, is the occasion for God creating the action.
Okay, that makes sense.
Man can't originate anything out of nothing, but he acquires the merit or the demerit, the reward or the sin, because he intended it to happen, and God accommodated that intention by creating the act.
But if you are listening to this, you haven't even heard the wildest part yet. Here's where it gets really interesting. To support this theology of God's absolute, unceasing control over every single action, the Asherites had to build what the texts describe as a staggering, radical metaphysical system.
Yeah, this is where it gets surreal.
To explain how God creates our actions in real time, they adopted a radical form of atomism. But not like modern scientific atoms, and not even like Greek material atoms. They argued that the universe is entirely made up of non-material atoms, or monads, that have no physical size and only have a momentary existence in time.
Yes. Picture indivisible points of reality, completely isolated from one another in space and time. They don't touch and they don't influence each other.
And because these atoms only exist for a single micro moment before expiring, the universe isn't a solid, continuous thing. God is literally creating and annihilating these atoms every single infinitesimal instant.
Oh, exactly.
The universe is flashing in and out of existence, and this means, logically, there is no such thing as natural cause and effect.
This is the core of their worldview.
Let's go back to our earlier example. Fire doesn't burn cotton. That is an illusion. The fire is placed next to the cotton, and at that exact moment, God chooses to create the burning in the atoms of the cotton.
Right.
The fire didn't cause the burning. God caused the burning.
It is a total, unapologetic denial of natural causality. Philosophically, this is known as occasionalism. Why do they go to such extremes? Because they believed that assuming a cause must naturally have an effect puts a limit on God's freedom.
Because nature would be in charge?
Yes. If fire has to burn cotton by its very nature, then God isn't in control. Nature is. The only reason fire seems to always burn cotton is simply because that is God's habit. He usually renders it that way because he's orderly, but he doesn't have to.
I have to bring in another modern analogy here because reading this section blew my mind. This sounds exactly 100% like a computer simulation or a video game frame rate.
Oh, tip.
Think about a video game character. If they shoot a digital gun, a digital barrel explodes. The character thinks the bullet caused the explosion, but we know there is no physical bullet and no physical explosion. There is just a CPU generating frame after frame at 60 frames per second.
Yep.
The illusion of continuous reality, the illusion of cause and effect, is just the code being refreshed on the monitor.
It is a stunningly accurate parallel. The Asherite God is the ultimate CPU, re-rendering the universe millions of times a second.
But I have a serious question for you and for the listener to ponder. Doesn't this Asherite worldview completely destroy the foundation of scientific inquiry?
How so?
Well, if natural laws don't actually exist, if a dropped apple only falls because God decides to move it downward frame by frame, why bother studying physics? Why bother studying medicine if the medicine doesn't actually cure the disease, but rather God just cures the disease at the exact moment you swallow the pill?
If we look at this impartially, strictly from their theological perspective, protecting God's absolute, unchained omnipotence was entirely worth sacrificing the concept of natural causality. And honestly, it provided a flawless logical defense for the existence of miracles.
Oh, true. Because how do you explain a miracle like Moses parting the Red Sea or Jesus healing the blind?
Exactly. If natural laws are rigid, a miracle breaks the universe. But in the Asherite system, what is a miracle? It's nothing special at all.
Just a change in the code.
It's simply God deciding to slightly alter his habit of how he usually arranges the frames for a few seconds. He renders the fire, but simply chooses not to render the burning of the cotton. He renders the water, but chooses to render it stacked up like a wall instead of flowing flat. It requires zero extra effort from God.
That is logically watertight based on their premises.
It is. However, historically speaking, your concern about science is highly valid. The historical text notes that this Asherite system, which eventually became the overwhelmingly dominant theology of the Sunni Muslim community, did check the growth of unchecked philosophical free thought.
I can see why.
It heavily impacted the trajectory of scientific inquiry in certain regions because relying purely on empirical laws and believing that nature had its own independent power was viewed as borderline heretical, almost a form of atheism. You were giving God's power away to inanimate objects.
That is just wild. Okay, so we've got the ultra-rationalist Mutazilites on one end, demanding God conform to human justice. And we have the ultra-omnipotent, matrix-like atomism of the Asherites on the other, where human reason is subordinate to a frame-by-frame rendering of reality.
Right.
But the sources show that not everyone was comfortable living at these extreme poles. This brings us to a really fascinating movement, the middle paths.
Yes. While Asherism was dominating the intellectual circles of Iraq and Baghdad, thinkers in other, equally important parts of the empire were trying to carve out a more balanced reconciliation. We see this specifically with the emergence of Taoism in Egypt and Maturidism in Central Asia.
They wanted a middle ground.
They looked at the chaos in Iraq and said, we need a more grounded approach.
Let's look at Taoism first. Founded by al-Tahawi, who was operating out of Egypt, vigorously defending the views of the great jurist Imam Abu Hanifa. The texts portray the Tahawis as pragmatic legalists.
Yes, very practical.
They didn't want to get bogged down in dizzying metaphysics about atoms popping in and out of existence. They cared about practical, everyday living and jurisprudence. For instance, they tackled that original, explosive question about the grave sinner that started the whole Mutazilite movement.
Right, the question that caused Wazil ibn Ada to storm to the other side of the mosque. Are they believers or doomed unbelievers?
Taoism takes a much more grounded, merciful approach. They argue that a grave sinner is still fundamentally a believer, provided they haven't openly rejected the core tenets of the faith.
Okay.
And more importantly, they are not automatically doomed to eternal hell. God might punish them in hell for a temporary time to purify them of their sin, or crucially, he might just entirely forgive them out of his infinite grace. It's highly practical. It leaves the door open for hope, which is what average people actually need from a religion.
And Tahoe was deeply concerned with fighting anthropomorphism.
Defining that for the listener, that's the tendency to give God human physical traits like hands, a face, or a physical location in the sky.
Correct. Some of the extreme Orthodox literalists at the time were doing exactly that, taking metaphors in the text way too literally. Tahawi explicitly states that God is not a body, has no physical limits, and is not contained by the 6 directions up, down, front, back, left, right. But he achieves this sophisticated theology without entirely discarding human reason and without adopting the bizarre atomism of the Asherites. He stayed firmly rooted in the tradition of Islamic law and jurisprudence.
But the real philosophical heavyweight of this middle path seems to be al-Maturidi, operating way over in Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan. The sources dive deep into his epistemology, his theory of how we actually acquire knowledge.
Maturidi was highly systematic, almost like a modern cognitive scientist in his approach. He clearly stated that knowledge comes from 3 valid sources: the physical senses, historical reports, which includes religious revelation, and human reason.
Okay.
Reason processes the data from the senses and the reports, but he explicitly, aggressively rejected inspiration as a source of objective truth.
Why? I feel like divine inspiration is a huge part of most spiritual traditions. Why would he ban it from his system?
Because, he argued, if everyone relies on their own personal internal inspiration or intuition, you have absolutely no universal standard of judgment. If you say, my heart tells me this is true, and I say, well, my heart tells me the exact opposite, how do we resolve the conflict?
We can't.
We can't. It creates utter chaos. It destroys the ability to have a shared reality, a functioning legal system, or a cohesive civilization. Reason and shared texts are required to process the world, not subjective feelings.
That is incredibly relevant today. Think about our modern culture where people constantly talk about my truth or what feels right to me, completely discarding objective facts or shared reality. Maturidi was calling out the danger of the echo chamber 1,000 years ago.
He really was.
He saw that subjective inspiration leads to societal breakdown.
Exactly. And once he established that firm foundation of knowledge, Maturidi established 2 great principles for understanding God. Tanzi, which means absolute freedom from similitude, basically. God is nothing like creation, period, and hikmah, which translates to divine wisdom.
And hikmah, this concept of wisdom, is his key to solving the free will debate without turning God into an irrational tyrant.
Right.
Unlike the Asherites, who said God acts without any external purpose or reason, Maturidi says God is inherently wise, so his actions must naturally contain a wise purpose, even if we can't fully grasp it.
That's the balance.
So I have to challenge this because I am looking at the notes and I feel like Maturidi is pulling a fast one on us. Isn't Maturidism just Mutazilite rationalism wearing a clever orthodox disguise?
Why do you say that?
I mean, think about it. They both heavily value human reason, and they both say God's actions are driven by wisdom and purpose. How is he different from the guys who got chased out of town?
It's a very sharp observation. But the nuance is critical to understanding Islamic philosophy. Maturity believed reason is essential, yes. It is a tool given by God. But he believed that tool must ultimately submit to revelation when it reaches its limits. Reason can take you to the door, but revelation opens it. And on the deeply thorny issue of free will and human sin, he walked a brilliant, microscopic philosophical tightrope. Let's recap. The Mutazilites said God doesn't create human evil, humans do. The Asherites said God creates everything, including the physical act of murder, and man just acquires it.
Right. So where does maturity land?
Maturity formulates a subtle distinction between God's will and God of command. He says God wills evil to happen, meaning God allows it to exist in the universe because God desires humans to have the genuine capacity for free choice.
Okay, I'm following.
A world without the possibility of evil is a world without free will. But crucially, God never commands evil, and God never finds pleasure in evil.
Okay, I think I see the distinction. Let me try an analogy.
Let's hear it.
It's like a parent teaching a teenager how to manage money. The parent gives the kid an allowance. The kid says, I want to spend all my money on candy instead of saving it. The parent wills the kid to make the purchase, meaning they don't physically grab the kid's arm and stop them. They allow the action to happen, so the kid learns a lesson about being broke.
Right.
But the parent didn't command the kid to buy candy, and they certainly aren't pleased about it.
That is a very solid, relatable analogy. Sin, for maturity, is not going against God's ultimate cosmic will, because logically, nothing can happen in the universe against the will of an omnipotent God. Rather, sin is violating God's specific command and moral guidance.
That's a really smart distinction.
It's a brilliant formulation. It allows God to be fully, totally sovereign over every atom in the universe without making him a tyrant who forces people to sin and then punishes them for it.
Wow. It is truly incredible how finely they slice these concepts. They were operating on a level of metaphysical precision that is frankly intimidating.
Extremely.
But as brilliant as it was, even this middle path was way too much philosophical gymnastics for some people. Which brings us to the next massive shift in our sources. Because if you are listening to this and you are starting to feel a headache coming on from distinguishing between willing evil and commanding evil, or imagining atoms blinking in and out of existence, you aren't the only one who felt that way. A whole movement started that decided to throw out logic entirely.
Yes, you can entirely understand why a group of devout, historically grounded people threw their hands up in the air, pointed to the Qur'an and said, stop. Stop the debates. Stop the Greek logic. Stop the analogies. Just read the text exactly as it is written.
Enter the Zahiri school, the strict literalists. The movement was originally founded in the East by Dawood ibn Ali, but it was really popularized and weaponized in Muslim Spain by a brilliant, fierce, uncompromising thinker named Ibn Hazm.
Ibn Hazm is a fascinating character.
He really is. The Zahirites had two main targets they wanted to destroy. They absolutely rejected qiyas, which is analogical deduction in law, and they entirely rejected taqlid, which is the practice of blindly following the rulings of previous scholars.
To truly understand Zahirism, you have to understand their absolute, unyielding devotion to the Zahir, the explicit, apparent, literal meaning of the words on the page. They believed that God gave humanity the text in clear Arabic. If God meant something else, or if God wanted to imply a deeper hidden meaning, he would have simply said something else.
Right.
To assume God spoke in riddles or left things out is an insult to the perfection of revelation.
Let's explain why rejecting qiyas, or analogy, is such a big deal. The vast majority of Islamic law relies on analogy. For example, the Qur'an explicitly forbids drinking wine, but it doesn't mention vodka because vodka didn't exist in 7th century Arabia.
Obviously.
Most scholars use qiyas to say, okay, the underlying reason, the cause wine is banned, is because it intoxicates. Vodka also intoxicates. Therefore, by analogy, vodka is banned.
Exactly. That is standard, rational jurisprudence used by almost everyone. But the Zahirite looks at that and says, no, you are inventing laws. God banned wine. He didn't ban vodka. If you ban vodka based on your human assumption of God's reasoning, you are playing God. They demanded strict adherence only to what is explicitly named.
The historical text gives us this highly specific, incredibly memorable example about the rules for a fasting traveler that perfectly illustrates this rigid mindset.
The fasting rule, yes.
Standard Islamic law says that if a Muslim is traveling during the mandatory fasting month of Ramadan, they face a physical hardship. Therefore, they may choose to break their fast and then simply make up those missed days later when they are home. It's a concession of mercy. But Zahirism looks at the specific literal verse in the Qur'an, which reads, "But he among you who shall be sick or on a journey shall fast the same number of other days."
And if you're a Zahirite, you read that sentence like a computer reading code. Notice there is no word may or permitted in that verse.
Exactly. The Zahirites say the text doesn't say you have permission to break your fast if you want to. It states a factual command. If you are on a journey, you fast other days. Therefore, they conclude, if you actually try to be pious and keep your fast while traveling, your fast is completely 100% invalid.
Right. It's totally void.
It doesn't count. You are still legally required to fast other days when you get home, because the text literally commanded fasting other days.
It is a stunningly rigid, almost algorithmic application of grammar over common sense or human comfort. You can imagine arguing with a Zahiri judge. It would be impossible.
A nightmare.
They don't care about your intent or your logic. They only care about the syntax of the sentence. But here's what makes it fascinating. Ibn Hazm, their greatest champion, wasn't just some simple, uneducated literalist yelling in a desert. He was incredibly, intimidatingly educated.
That is the ultimate paradox of Ibn Hazm. The sources say he was deeply versed in Greek philosophy. He studied Euclidean geometry, Aristotelian dialectics, formal logic. He knew all the tools of the Mutazilites and Ash'arites intimately, and he used this intense, hyper-complex logic to systematically prove that humans shouldn't use logic in theology.
He was using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. Because of his background in mathematics and geometry, he understood axioms. An axiom is a starting point that you just have to accept as true to do the math.
Okay, sure.
For Ibn Hazm, the literal text was the ultimate, unquestionable axiom. He aggressively argued that trying to find the underlying cause or the rational human reason for God's laws is a massive, arrogant mistake. God doesn't need underlying causes that our tiny human brains can deduce.
Right.
Going back to dietary laws, why is pork forbidden? A rationalist might say because pigs are dirty and carry trichinosis. Ibn Hazm would scream at you, no, it's forbidden simply because God said so. If God commanded us to eat pork tomorrow, it would instantly become good. God commands because he commands. Full stop.
I can't help but compare this mindset to hyper-strict constitutional originalism in modern American law. The idea that a judge should only look at the exact literal words on the 18th century page with zero interpretation of the founder's intent and zero adaptation for modern societal changes.
It's a very similar framework.
But if I push back on this, the obvious flaw emerges. If they rely entirely, exclusively on the literal text, what happens when the text inevitably runs out of specific answers for new, modern problems that didn't exist in the 7th century?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of Ibn Hazm's worldview, his answer to that pushback is fascinating, if a bit strained. He genuinely believed the text never runs out.
Never.
Never. He argued that the Qur'an and the authentic sayings of the Prophet actually cover everything humanity will ever need, either explicitly in the text or through basic linguistic imperatives built into the Arabic language. He believed that to say the text is insufficient, or that we need human analogies to fill in the gaps, is a profound insult to God, who explicitly stated in the Qur'an, "We have neglected nothing in the book."
So he doubled down.
He doubled down hard. But, as you might guess, this rigid, uncompromising, highly inflexible stance, coupled with Ibn Hazm's personal tendency to use very harsh, insulting language against scholars who disagreed with him, ultimately led to the downfall of Zahirism.
It pushed people away.
It became a persecuted, isolated philosophy. It simply couldn't survive as a mainstream system of law, especially in a complex, diverse society like Muslim Spain, which needed flexibility to function.
It's the ultimate purist trap. When you refuse to bend, you eventually snap, which serves as the absolute perfect contrast for our final stop today. Because if Zahirism was the ultimate public, literal, grammar-obsessed interpretation of religion, our final group went in the exact opposite direction.
Oh, completely opposite.
They went entirely underground, they're highly esoteric, and they believed that almost everything in the text was just a metaphor for a deeper, hidden truth.
We are talking about the enigmatic Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity.
The sources paint such a moody, mysterious picture of this group. It feels like stepping into a historical thriller.
Doesn't it?
They were a completely anonymous group operating in Basra in the 10th century. They wrote 53 epistles or treatises, which basically formed a massive encyclopedia of all known science, math, and philosophy of their time.
It was a huge undertaking.
The text describes them as libres penseurs, free thinkers. They were trying to form a spiritual, intellectual utopia entirely hidden from the public eye to escape the bitter sectarian violence, the assassinations, and the political chaos of the empire.
You have to remember, 10th century Basra was a dangerous place if you held the wrong theological views. People were getting executed for heresy. So going underground wasn't just dramatic, it was a survival tactic.
That makes sense.
And the philosophy they were protecting was a massive, breathtaking syncretism. They didn't just study Islamic theology and stop there. They pulled from literally every intellectual tradition available. They integrated Pythagorean mysticism, believing that numbers weren't just symbols for counting, but actual spiritual entities that had a pre-existence in the mind of the creator. They used Euclidean geometry, Ptolemaic models of the cosmos with its concentric spheres, and Aristotle's logic.
And their metaphysics, their theory of how the universe was created, is absolutely breathtaking. They adopted a form of Neoplatonic emanation theory.
Which is very different from creation out of nothing.
Right. They believed that God, the absolute one, is too pure, too exalted to interact directly with messy, dirty physical matter. So God doesn't reach down and mold the earth like clay. Instead, God simply radiates or emanates. God creates the universal intellect. The intellect then emanates the world soul. The world soul emanates first matter, then from matter come the celestial spheres, the stars, and finally the 4 physical elements down here on Earth.
I think we need an analogy for emanation because it's a tricky concept compared to traditional creation out of nothing.
How about a light bulb? God is the filament of the light bulb. He just exists and shines. He doesn't physically touch the desk below him. But the filament emanates light. The light passes through the glass bulb, which emanates heat into the air, which eventually warms the wood of the desk. The heat on the desk is caused by the filament, but the filament never descended to touch the desk. It's a cascading sequence of creation.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. It protects God's absolute purity while explaining how the physical universe came to be. But what goes down must come back up. The emanation flows downward from God into gross matter, but then there is a spiritual evolutionary flow driving everything back upward toward the source.
Yes, this part blew my mind. Remember, this is the 10th century, and the texts outline a clear evolutionary sequence. They wrote that minerals at the bottom of the material world slowly evolve and refine over eons into plants. Plants evolve into animals. The animal kingdom culminates in the ape, which closely resembles man. And then man, through the acquisition of knowledge and philosophy, evolves toward the angelic state.
It is a stunning precursor to modern evolutionary thought, though we have to be clear, it is a spiritual evolution, not a Darwinian biological one driven by natural selection.
Right, it's not about physical survival.
No, it is driven by the soul's innate, desperate desire to return to its pure spiritual source. And this brings us to their esoteric interpretation of religion, to the brethren of purity, the literal stories of the prophets, the stories of Adam, Eve, the snake, the fall, heaven, hell, are all just allegories. They are useful metaphors meant to keep the uneducated masses in line.
Right, they say Adam isn't a literal guy who lived in a literal garden and ate a physical apple. To them, Adam is a symbol, a cipher, for the world soul becoming trapped in a physical human body because of its own curiosity and lust for material power. When the text says Adam is cast out of paradise, it's actually describing the tragedy of the soul falling into the heavy, dark material world.
And following that logic, death isn't a punishment. For them, physical death is the lesser resurrection, is the joyous moment the soul finally escapes the gross physical body. Exactly. And the greater resurrection, the ultimate end of time, isn't about bodies rising from graves. It is the moment when all individual souls finally purify themselves and reunite with the universal world soul. The physical universe ceases to exist entirely, and only the pure emanation of God remains.
So hearing all this, I have to ask the obvious question. Were these thinkers essentially the 10th century equivalent of the Illuminati or the Freemasons? I mean, think about it. A secret, highly educated elite who believed they alone held the true science, math, and evolutionary secrets of the universe, while intentionally letting the uneducated masses believe in literal fairy tales because they couldn't handle the abstract, blinding truth.
The comparison is actually incredibly apt, and it's supported by the text. The sources explicitly note their strict, almost cult-like rules on friendship, loyalty, and absolute secrecy. You didn't just join the brethren, you were vetted. They only recruited people who had the intellectual capacity to handle the terrifying truth that their childhood stories were just metaphors. They genuinely believed the masses needed the literal stories, the fear of a literal fiery hell, to maintain moral order in society. But they believed that the true philosopher, the initiate, understands the sacred math, the celestial spheres, and the spiritual evolution hiding behind the metaphor.
It's a heavy burden to carry.
For them, the ultimate goal of all their science, their geometry, and their ethics wasn't just to be smart or to build better bridges. It was purely functional. It was to purify the soul through knowledge, to prepare it to escape the physical trap of the body and rejoin the world soul.
It is a staggering, beautiful, and slightly elitist vision of the universe. And it brings us to the end of this massive, winding deep dive through the early Islamic intellectual landscape. Just look at the ground we've covered. We have journeyed from the ultra-rational Mutazilites, who boldly demanded that the creator of the universe conform to human definitions of justice. We witnessed the massive backlash, leading to the matrix-like atomism of the Ash'arites, who rendered the universe frame by frame just to protect God's absolute freedom. We navigated the moderate balancers trying to hold society together in Egypt and Samarkand. We swung wildly into the strict, grammar-obsessed literalism of the Zahirites in Spain. And finally, we descended underground into the mystic, mathematically evolutionary secret society of the Ikhwan al-Safa in Basra.
It is an absolute testament to the incredible, explosive intellectual vitality of that era. Every possible angle, every conceivable permutation of the relationship between the tiny human mind and the infinite divine was explored, debated, written down, and systematized. They left no stone unturned.
And I want to remind you, the listener, whether you are driving to work, doing the dishes, or just sitting and thinking this isn't just dusty history. Whenever you pull out your phone to read the news and try to parse fact from fiction, whenever you rely on empirical science to cure a sickness, whenever you debate the meaning of religious text, or whenever you use abstract philosophy to try and understand your place in the vastness of the world, you are walking in the exact footsteps of these scholars.
It's all connected.
You are engaging in the very same eternal human struggle to find the truth in a chaotic universe.
And reviewing all of this raises a highly important question, a final provocative thought I want to leave you with. We've spent this hour looking at all these radically different operating systems for reality. If the Asherite atomists were right, and the natural causality we observe every single day, the fire burning the cotton, is just an illusion masking a divine frame rate.
Or if the Ikhwan al-Safa were right, and our heavy physical bodies are just temporary traps for a soul on a grand mathematical evolutionary journey back to the world soul.
How much of what we confidently, arrogantly call modern objective science today might just be another temporary metaphor.
Right. Are we just staring closely at the pixels on the screen, entirely unaware of the deeper, massive source code running in the background that we haven't even begun to grasp? Think about that the next time you drop an apple and watch it fall. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.